use paper step lesson.
Yeah, I could.
You ready? All right, we're live. So today's episode will focus on the bubble boy. Where would the group like to start? Kenny? What's going on here?
I think he might have a cluster B personality disorder, but I think it was kind of hard to determine that because he was only interacting with Jerry. There was something maybe along the lines of narcissistic or borderline, but I didn't really see enough evidence to say that just because the one thing that was very evident was kind of like this almost manipulative behavior. Like go to the suit, now you have to do this for me, and then not having this like self-awareness for like the social cues that Jerry was having, or why Jerry was so like not understanding why Jerry was so upset. So I don't know if those two.
This is the whole.
I don't know if that's.
Yeah.
Boy.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like this Kenny.
Yeah. Like
No worries. And off the top of my head, I can't think of the episode.
he's like a comedian, like a half comedian.
Yeah, Banyan, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is it the soup?
Yes, and just saying like he's like, oh, a meal, a soup doesn't count as a meal.
Right. Yeah, I think we might be looking at the wrong. I mean, listen, sometimes people come in and in our psychotherapy notes, we sometimes get the wrong sessions documented. So we'll stick to the bubble boy. Thoughts?
We can always talk about Kramer. It's always just bizarre. I mean, I feel like this episode is like latest obsessions with the like cigars, and then obviously, like inadvertently, he ends up leaving that in the cabin, and the whole cabin ends up burning down. But also his response to it at the end was pretty inappropriate because instead of being like, "Oh, the cabin, I'm so sorry," he's like, "My cigars," and tries to run back into like a burning building. So
Yeah.
I mean, we said before maybe schizotypal features, but I don't even know to kind of make of this preoccupation.
Right. Yeah. No, and I agree with you. This looks like to be a schizotypal personality disorder. You know, I think that there are some episodes where, while there is eccentricity, we don't see the illusions and we don't see the other things that tend to define schizotypal. And he looks like he's on that spectrum where it might be more of a schizoid personality or schizoid personality traits. But in either case, what we're doing is discussing the cluster A personality disorder. So interestingly, we switched from Banyan in, I think, perhaps the soup. It was the soup. Okay, it was just a lucky guess on my part. Switching therefore from cluster B to cluster A. The third cluster A personality disorder happens to be the paranoid personality disorder, that which is defined through a pervasive distrust and suspiciousness of others. Right. I think more importantly for us, and it's more of a clinical pearl, although one you'll certainly see in a case vignette, but I don't think it'll be too difficult to identify it, and that is how behaviors like this, eccentricities, can result in clinically significant distress or impairment in this case, Kramer or others, including Susan and her family, and certainly in terms of the outcome of their cabin. Right, so, and we could probably create a nice discussion on Kramer himself, not necessarily, well, of course, incorporating those aspects and traits of the cluster A personality disorders, but also, and again, clinically, perhaps more importantly, the actual suffering that it causes, the actual clinical significance in each of these episodes, and we see it here. And that's exactly, I think, what you identified here. Any other thoughts about Kramer? And what questions do we have about any of the cluster A personalities?
I do have a question about cluster A personality disorder. So I think one of the biggest things about psychiatry is there needs to be, like you were saying, kind of like a clinical significance to it. Like it has to affect them. I feel like some of the personality disorders, I can see how maybe it would not quite, or like for example, schizoid, the patient might be content, and it's kind of hard to say that you need to have friends or you need to have people around you to have like quote normal or like good or life. So I guess kind of what's like the line where you have someone who's schizoid personality disorder, this is a diagnosis, this is, kind of labeling it something, calling it like in a way pathological. At what point do you kind of just accept that some people are just going to live their lives a little bit in isolation and that's how they are?
So I think in starting out, we would always accept that a person can live their life out the way they choose. But in terms of psychiatry, individuals will often present us with a chief complaint and or present through a third party, whether it be the criminal justice system, whether it be the Board of Health, etc. Because individuals who have schizoid personality are by definition content on your shelf, these individuals are much more likely to present through a third party. And even though the person may say, I'm fine, and be telling you the truth, are reliable, the larger scope paints a picture where it is not fine, because the Board of Health is telling you they're going to be evicted, right? So clinical significance will always be that line, self or others, and self-report or collateral Board of Health, law enforcement, etc. Right, so that's the way to approach it. And the way this often comes up on an exam is, again, third-party referral, and someone who is content and being able to distinguish their behavior, probably labeled schizoid personality disorder, from the avoidant personality, right? Because individuals who avoid present similar to, although they're more likely to be the self-referral, right? Because they are conflicted, because they do want to be out there. They just feel inhibited of putting themselves out there. Did that address or answer your question?
Yeah. And one more thing is, how do you go about, like, do you disclose this diagnosis? I feel like personality disorders are a kind of difficult diagnosis to disclose to the patient sometimes, because
It is true. They shouldn't be, though. Personality disorder should be looked upon as any disorder, which means that they, with regard to healthcare equity, should be looked upon as any illness, period. So if you are prohibited, if you feel concerned about discussing a personality disorder with a patient, that might be okay, as long as you agree that you should feel just as inhibited as in discussing someone's heart disease or cancer, which of course, if you're wearing a white coat, would seem preposterous, right? So healthcare equity, mental illness equals physical illness, and within mental illness, all mental illnesses should be approached the same. And that is, if they are resulting in clinically significant distress or impairment in functioning, it must be addressed. Yep. But that said, there's a hidden curriculum where even a lot of practitioners, a lot of psychiatrists certainly behave in the way in which you just described. There's no doubt about that. And I know what the next thought that pops in, or perhaps the thought that even resulted in your asking the question, and that is, well, doesn't that diagnosis then kind of follow a person around? Yes, so does leukemia. Okay. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm just saying that what we're identifying exists is no different than any other illness, including physical illness. Any questions about Kramer? Ideas, thoughts? And by the way, another great parallel, kind of just for bringing this together. Imagine if Kramer were a psychiatrist. I mean, so there'd be some issues, right? However, one issue that would not be there is that his feeling inhibited in discussing people's problems with them, right? He would not be, this is not someone who would be in that group that would almost feel ashamed of saying, I believe you're afflicted with a condition called schizoid personality or borderline personality. What other characters you want to discuss this morning?
That'd be the little boy.
The bubble boy.
I think his name was Donald.
Okay.
Obviously he lives a very isolated life, both physically and it also seems emotionally as well. Because there doesn't seem to be much interaction between his parents and himself and him with like the rest of society. I think a component of that, and it's kind of evidence in his behaviors, is that he has like an air of like self-righteousness where he's like, I am right, I'm correct. And like, especially when they're playing the game, like I'm correct in this game, I know the answer. And then to me, that kind of lends a little bit like narcissistic personality disorder. because he wants to be this, he is a center of attention in the town especially, as evidenced by all the townspeople kind of knowing who he is, knowing that, he was attacked, quote unquote. But it seems like he may be experiencing some components of narcissistic personality disorder. And then also on top of that, there may be some episodes of like aggression and like agitated behavior that may resemble like intermittent explosive disorder as well. Especially when he got so upset over the fact that the answer card was incorrectly spelled and George is not giving him credit for the point.
There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah.
I think you brought up a lot of points that we could go in a lot of directions with this. So when somebody presents, we'll call that someone Donald, with signs and symptoms that you just identified. What is the first thing, what should pop in your head within seconds of sitting across a desk from Donald, assuming that, there's the proper barrier up, everybody's safe? What stance, what's always your starting point when talking to a patient? It's that whatever they're presenting, whatever the chief complaint is within the realm of normal.
Yeah.
Right. And again, I don't care if you have to move off that point within seconds. I want your brain to always be set to that point. Okay. Do we know Donald's age? Can somebody just quick search how old is Donald the Bubble Boy? I don't. Maybe there's something on Reddit.
I'm not sure if it does, because I was wondering that like the whole time too. I'm not sure if it's best.
I don't think it does.
They can make
It's, I think adolescence, like 10 to 11, all the way up to like early teens. Or late teens.
the voice out there.
Yeah.
It sounded like he was in his 20s, maybe.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah.
Because even like I don't know, just his whole demeanor, I was like, I was expecting like an innocent kid, and then you get what he is, and it's just like in such sharp contrast to that narrative that's created.
So, within that framework of how we are going to approach a clinical situation with unconditional positive regard, again, borrowing from Rogers, is this idea of healthy narcissism, right? We all were at a particular age where we understood that the entire universe, the solar system, does revolve around us, right? And how did we learn that? How in the world would we have arrived at that conclusion?
Like based on kind of like, I guess, like attachment patterns.
Exactly. And who's probably the one who established that attachment? Yeah, more times than not, it's going to be mom. I mean, listen, we blame mom for everything wrong. Let's blame her for something right here, right? That is, when we were 2 or 3, life was perfect because the world did revolve around us. Thank you, mom. So thank your mothers today when you go home. Now, at some point, that changes, right? That belief that the world revolves around you, when developmentally appropriate, goes by several different names. One is healthy childhood narcissism, and that's COHA. That's stage theorists, developmental theorists. Until we're told, hey, the world does not revolve around you, probably also likely being verbalized by mom. At that point, the child begins to develop a sense of empathy. The idea that there are more people in this world other than me, and I have to begin to appreciate their perspective. Right? It's the development of empathy. And then empathy becomes a necessary building block for compassion towards others. And when that development derails, things can turn pathological, the most severe of which is called the narcissistic personality disorder. Right? So a very quick, overly simplistic primer on the development of narcissism, which starts out healthy in all of us, but then ultimately for most of us develops into aspects of empathy and even compassion. What might derail that natural development? Why would a person who starts out narcissistic, like any of us were 2, 3, 4, stay narcissistic or stay egocentric. That's the real psychological term here.
They're like constantly, if they never are able to move beyond this state where they depend on, their caretaker, or they're never able to interact with other people their age who are always also progressing to that.
And what might result in their not being able to have those types of social experiences?
They might kind of stay at that earlier age.
Why? Give me an example. Trauma. Right? We'll call all the above trauma. Again, it could be emotional, it could be physical, it could be sexual, it could be all of the above. It could be sub-threshold. Right? But there's something that derails the quote unquote normal development. I don't think with this idea, I don't think it's that hard now to understand why Donald is presenting narcissistic like. Now, I don't know. I don't think we've seen enough of this where we can say, well, he was remaining egocentric, which is just a clinical descriptor. And again, we're talking about age inappropriate egocentrism, or whether or not he's at the other end of that spectrum where he has a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder, again, per Kohut, the most severe form. I think Kohut theorized this comes in 4 stages. Right? So once one derails from healthy infantile or childhood narcissism, there's 4 stages. The 4th and final stage, the most severe, is the actual personality disorder. So, and I don't know where we are with this, but I think we do understand that it is age inappropriate. So it's definitely developmentally inappropriate. And may, in fact, that is query the narcissistic personality disorder.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
As far as how we develop our defense mechanisms, I would imagine this also probably starts around the same time.
Mhm.
And so with the bubble boy, he acts out quite a lot when he doesn't get his way. Do you also connect that to the fact that he's not progressing through what we also don't know how old he is, so it makes it difficult to sort of determine where he is in this pathway, but his acting out when he doesn't get his way, could that be related to the fact that he's also hasn't developed healthy coping mechanisms?
Oh, yeah.
Because not.
Mhm. Yeah, and the way I would frame this again is when we kind of now fold in the idea of defense mechanisms is, what may have predisposed to what we're observing as now adolescent behavior, what precipitates it, and then what are the perpetuating factors. And at each stage of those 3 Ps, we have biopsychosocial factors that can figure in. Among the psychological factors are the defense mechanisms. And I think it's fairly easy to see that these psychological factors called defense mechanisms are perpetuating the behavior. So he's not able to break the cycle, largely due to his maladaptive use of acting out. So again, the 3 Ps merging with the biopsychosocial case approach.
I think too, like also his parents are obviously like a big kind of perpetuating factor. I mean, I think obviously it's out of like compassion for him because they recognize that he has like a lot of limited ability to interact with the outside world or to even kind of engage in normal like youthful activities. But just by the way that like when they walked in the house and was like, Mom, can I get some like up here, she was very much like, she also like enabled that behavior because she responded to it, which reinforced that like in his mind, that's okay, that he can get that reward if he continues to kind of act out in that way.
Right. So where we identify defense mechanisms as psychological factors that perpetuate the behavior, now we're identifying social factors. So we're really shaping a biopsychosocial perspective on what is perpetuating the bubble boy's quote unquote narcissistic behavior. And you used a big word, reinforcement here. So within those perpetuating factors, specifically the social factors of what we're observing from the parents, we have now elements of behavioral psychology, including reinforcement. So a little bit of a tangent here. Somebody tell me the difference between operant conditioning versus classical conditioning, because you brought it up. And it can, in fact, appear on shelf exams.
The classical is when you associate like an unconscious stimuli with a, or sorry,
Unconditioned,
sorry.
Freudian slip.
Yeah, with like an unconscious response. So it's like the classic example is like Pavlov's dog. So the bell and the bell is like the stimulus, and then salivating is like an unconscious response.
Unconditioned.
Sorry, unconditioned. Blech. And then
That's exactly right. So again, learning by association. By the way, on a shelf exam, the common way this presents is an individual who has undergone cancer chemotherapy and months later, when in remission, drives to the parking lot of the hospital and becomes nauseous. Right? So again, the response is an associative response. It's a Pavlovian response. It is a response that is classically conditioned. It's a very common test question. And that differs from operant conditioning. How?
operant conditioning is more of like a positive versus negative reinforcement. So you kind of pair certain behaviors and positive. This is like commonly confusing. A positive is you're actually giving something, so that could I think pain is technically considered positive because you're like giving something in addition, kind of, and a negative is taking something away, so like taking away a reward.
Yep, everybody got that, right?
Mhm.
So let's review this again. And again, correct. Whereas classical conditioning is learning through association, operant conditioning is learning by consequences. It's consequential learning. It's Skinnerian learning. When you get a test question, when you get a question on your shelf with the 4 answers, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, approach it in a 2-step way. Step number 1, you have to ask yourself, is the behavior strengthened or weakened? So read that case vignette with that single question in mind. If the behavior in question is strengthened, it can only be reinforcement. So you cross any punishment answer off your list of 4. Once you ask that question, then the second question is exactly what you addressed, and that is something added to the equation or removed? If it's added, it's positive. If it's removed, it's negative. If you just stick to that 2-pronged approach, you'll never get a question on operant conditioning incorrect. Is behavior strengthened or weakened? Strengthened equals reinforcement, weakened equals punishment. And number 2, is something added or removed to induce that response? Right. Let's talk about, and not that we actually have issues pertaining to alcohol in this particular episode, but let's talk about disulfiram, because it appears on exams very, very often. What is disulfiram?
Like basically drug that can interfere with like enzymatic, I guess, like metabolism of alcohol, so like produces symptoms of like a hangover to like an extreme effect. So
And what enzyme? Very. Okay. Acetaldehyde dehydrogenase will be answer C or D. Alcohol dehydrogenase will be answer A or B. People who write test questions like myself love tricking students who are very tense, very anxious, and read questions too fast. And of course, read through the answers too fast. It's acetaldehyde dehydrogenase, and we will never put that as answer A or B. Right, so please read those questions, or excuse me, the answers very, very closely. You're right, that is an enzyme that catalyzes the rate limiting step of alcohol breakdown. What results is a buildup of aldehyde, which is toxic. What happens when you have excess aldehyde in your bloodstream? What's the toxicity? What actually happens when aldehyde builds in the bloodstream?
You get flushed.
Nauseous, being flushed.
when you're-
Exactly right. Diaphoresis, you could faint, make you pre-syncopal. That is called the disulfiram reaction. Disulfiram being the brand name of, I'm sorry, the generic of antabuse, which is the brand name. What type of learning? So the idea is that prescribing this medication called branded disulfiram is a part of a biopsychosocial approach. It's the bio of maintaining abstinence in someone who is afflicted with alcohol use disorder. What type of learning does this take advantage of? Louder? Operant conditioning would be correct. Unfortunately, it's not going to be an answer in your set.
Positive punishment.
Positive punishment.
You want to weaken the behavior and you're adding something.
Perfect. All right. I will tell you that a lot of medical students say it's negative reinforcement, which is the complete opposite. Right. But if you just break down the question with those two steps, you can't get it wrong. Okay. Any other observations, thoughts on Donald or any other characters in the Bubble Boy?
I'm interested in his interaction with Jordan, because he also kind of helps. He also has some kind of features that makes his interactions with Donald more difficult than they need to be. So like we're talking about, like possible reasons why Donald may have narcissistic features, but George also shows similar features, and you don't really have an explanation why he would. But the insistence that Morris is incorrect because the card says news is kind of absurd on its face. Like, especially considering the whole reason why he came there in the first place was, in a sense, to try to comfort or bring some joy to this boy. And then also, like, when they first came into the house, George started speaking of like, oh yeah, I have like lots of bubbles in my family, like my cousin and all that. Or, unclear reason why he needs to brag about having, immunocompromised family members, but it's also interesting.
I completely agree. So I don't think many of us would have significant concerns identifying that George, while he might not meet the full diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder per se, certainly is egocentric. I think that's certainly something we could agree on. And of course, egocentrism at this age, again, age inappropriate egocentrism certainly provides and imparts increased risk for developing a narcissistic personality. There's no doubt about that. So, and we see these two figures clash, which we would expect when two narcissists actually begin to talk to one another. And this also gets, and we'll kind of end here with the root of this clinical term, this diagnosis, and where do we get the idea or the wording, the title of this disorder? Who is Narcissus?
It was like I don't know like what his actual job was. Or is it the Greek like folklore where an individual who basically was like in love with himself and loved the way he looked, which causes like significant disruption in his personal life with I think the woman he loved as well. I forgot the exact details of the story.
Yeah. So what happens is that this whole story actually starts with a story of Echo, right? Who's a maiden who has got the gift of gab. When she gets your attention, time just seems to melt away because of the way she's able to talk. And this gift is abused by Zeus, who makes sure that when he's on his different escapades with other women, he introduces Echo to his wife Hera, so that Hera has her attention impaired, right? Unfortunately for Echo, Hera becomes aware of what Zeus is up to, and the fact that he's the king of the gods prevents him from any kind of retaliation. So this is called displacement in psychiatry, where Hera's anger is going to be displaced and cathexed towards the person that she could harm, and that's unfortunately Echo. So what happens is that her gift becomes her curse, and she's not able to talk anymore. The only word she's able to say is the final word someone who speaks to her. She stumbles upon Narcissus and falls instantly in love. Unfortunately, she can't express her feelings. So ultimately, she is shunned by this huntsman. The gods of Olympus take note and curse him with the same type of outcome, saying that the next person you meet, you will actually experience unrequited love. And the next person he meets is himself through a reflection in the water in the riverbed. He's unable to pull himself away. He falls so deeply in love, his feet actually take root. And just before he expires his final breath, the gods of Olympus take pity on him and turn him into the narcissus, which is a flower that continues to grow on the muddy beds of rivers. Right? So we capture that essence. And it gets to the idea of narcissism in that individuals with this condition, and this includes egocentrism, who don't have things reflected back, draw the conclusion, therefore they don't exist. So my only self-worth is that which is reflected back to me, very consistent with the myth. If it's not reflected back, it doesn't exist. What's kind of interesting in this particular episode, and we're discussing the bubble boy, is that Larry David nails this, because there's this bubble, there's this plastic in front of George, and he sees something reflected back to him through that plastic. And it happens to be Donald, happens to be a younger version of himself.
Do you think that's why also we never fully see him? Like, in all the, because like that was kind of unsettling for me as like a viewer, the way like the camera, like it was filmed, like we never see that. We just see like a hand that's coming out of like plastic sheet.
We'd have to ask Larry David. So somebody tag him on Twitter and we'll get this answer. I don't know if this was inadvertent. I don't know if this was actually something discussed in a back conference room in terms of writing up this script, but it is interesting that George is staring at a piece of plastic and sees something reflected back that reminds him of a younger version of himself, whether he's actually seeing his true reflection or whether it's Donald or whether Donald even exists. I suggest he probably does, since there are parents there and we've seen George travel so far to meet him. So we'll end here. The other thing I want to mention too is that we have another story of unrequited love at 12 o'clock, ironically. Someone else who was hit by Eros's arrow and will not have that love returned to her. And we'll see some probably clinically significant outcomes in the story titled Misery. So that's at 12 o'clock and that's on Instagram Live. Thank you.